3,000 people stood in a river that smelled like rot, armed with shovels and woven baskets. No government contract, no engineering firm, no budget. And within a few years, hand pumps that had been dry for 40 years suddenly pushed water again. 6,000 acres of waterlogged, abandoned farmland came back into production. A river that official reports had described as effectively dead was flowing clean across 160 kilometers. I'm Tom Marsh, and this is the story of how a single monk in Punjab, India, did what 3 decades of government committees could not. But before we get to the transformation, we have to go back to what was lost. Because the Kali Bein was never just a river. For Sikhs across Punjab, this waterway carried a memory older than any government report. Guru Nanak Dev, the founder of Sikhism, is believed to have meditated on its banks, to have emerged from its waters carrying the message that would shape an entire faith. Pilgrims traveled to the Kali Bein seeking what every sacred river promises, a thread connecting the living to everything that came before them. The water was clear. The air in the mornings carried birdsong. Farmers drew from it. Children played at its edges. That world disappeared gradually and then all at once. By the time the 20th century had run its course, the Kali Bein had become something almost unrecognizable. Dozens of villages along its banks discharged untreated sewage directly into the channel. Paper mills and chemical plants emptied their waste without consequence, without fine, without even the formality of inspection. Invasive aquatic weeds had spread across the surface in a thick, unbroken mat, blocking sunlight, stripping oxygen from the water below. The fish vanished. In some stretches, the riverbed dried to cracked mud. In others, it filled with black, stagnant pools. The smell was the smell of abandonment. The children who had once swum there were told to stay away. Farmers who had relied on the river's flow watched their wells fall silent. Elders remembered mornings of ritual bathing and prayer, and found those memories had nowhere to land anymore. And none of this was guaranteed to change, because the machinery that should have responded was not broken. It was simply indifferent. State agencies had been filing reports on the Kali Bein since at least the 1970s. The documents were precise. They identified contamination sources, calculated ecological damage, recommended urgent intervention. Audit records from the 1970s through the 1990s show that millions of rupees were allocated for restoration work along the river. Almost none of it was spent on the ground. Not a single factory was fined. Not a single treatment plant was built. The money sat in accounts while the river continued to die. The residents who wrote letters received no replies. Those who raised the issue at public meetings were offered more studies. The names behind the decisions remained abstract. Signatures on memorandums, voices in committee rooms, none of them willing to stand on the riverbank and accept responsibility for what the water had become. 3 decades. That is how long the institutional process ran without producing a single kilometer of clean water. There are patterns behind stories like this one that rarely surface in the headlines. The Kali Bein is one of them. The way a single decision point can either hold or release everything, the cases where restoration succeeded not because of better funding, but because of a different kind of authority. If you want to go deeper than any single video can take you, the full resource is a collection called the Rewilding Complete Pack. It covers these recovery patterns in detail, the community models, the ecological mechanics, the cases that nearly failed, and what saved them. The link is in the description below, and if you're watching on screen, you can scan the QR code right now. What came next along the Kali Bein is exactly the kind of thing that PAC was built around. Because in July of 2000, a man stood on the bank of that ruined river and made a decision that had nothing to do with budgets or bureaucracy. Sant Balbir Singh Seechewal was known across Punjab. He had served as a senior administrator at the Golden Temple, and he understood service not as an abstraction, but as something done with hands and presence. He had watched the government cycle for years, the reports, the announcements, the inaction. On that summer morning, standing in front of water that smelled of decomposition, he made a public promise. If no one else was going to clean the Kali Bein, he would do it himself. He picked up a shovel and started digging. No cameras, no officials, no ceremony. Just the sound of metal entering mud. His call was rooted in the Sikh concept of Seva, selfless service given freely, without expectation of reward. He asked a simple question of everyone who would listen. If we will not restore our own sacred river, then who will? The answer came slowly at first, and then it came in thousands. Farmers appeared before dawn, shovels over their shoulders, working for an hour before walking to their fields. They understood what water meant better than any committee. Students arrived after school, some still in uniform. Women organized community kitchens along the riverbanks, managing food, tools, and logistics for teams that sometimes worked from first light until dark. Elders, who had stopped believing any of this was possible, came back to the water's edge to offer guidance and memory. Even children too young for the heavy work found ways to contribute. No one was paid. There was no external funding, no government order, no NGO directing the operation. The tools came from local farms, the food came from community kitchens. The fuel for borrowed tractors came from neighboring villages. By the end of the first season, more than 3,000 volunteers had taken part, each one motivated by a version of the same conviction, that the river belonged to the people who lived beside it, and that waiting for someone else to save it was a choice they were no longer willing to make. The work itself was physical in a way that is difficult to convey without standing in it. Teams extended across every section of the channel, digging in rotation so the work never stopped. The canal was widened by approximately 3 meters and deepened by 1. That alone took months of coordinated hand labor. The invasive water hyacinth, which had carpeted the surface for years, was pulled out by the root, loaded into baskets, and stacked on the banks. Clearing it was not cosmetic. It allowed sunlight to return to the water, restored oxygen exchange, and reopened the current. The contamination problem was addressed without waiting for infrastructure that would never arrive. Volunteers dug diversion trenches by hand, redirecting sewage flows from the villages into settling ponds constructed along field margins. These ponds allowed solids to settle and water to filter through soil before reaching crops. No chemicals, no electricity, gravity and time. In some stretches, embankments were built from local stone and earth, stabilizing the banks against monsoon flooding. Every element of the engineering relied on human effort and locally available materials. And here is where the story stops being beautiful and starts being important, because the effects were not limited to the water surface. Something was happening underground. A river, when it runs clean, does not only carry water from one place to another, it recharges the earth beneath it. Water filters through a healthy riverbed and refills underground aquifers, the natural reservoirs that feed hand pumps and wells across an entire region. For decades, the Kali Bein's bed had been sealed. Silt, rotting vegetation, and contaminated sediment had blocked that percolation. The water table fell. Wells went dry. Hand pumps fell silent one by one. When the volunteers finished clearing the channel and restored the river's flow, the process reversed. Water began moving through the soil again. In some areas, the water table rose by more than 1.5 meters. Hand pumps that had produced nothing for 40 years started flowing. The people who experienced this describe it with the kind of language we usually reserve for things we cannot fully explain. Elders who had spent half their lives carrying water from distant sources watched their grandchildren draw it from their own yards. And the land itself responded. 6,000 acres along the Kali Bein that had been waterlogged and abandoned by sustained neglect came back into production. As the river cleared and its flow regularized, the fields along its banks began to drain. Wheat and rice yields in the region reportedly increased by up to 30%. Families who had faced the prospect of losing their farms entirely were planting and harvesting again. The fish came back. Rohu, a species that had not been seen in the river for years, returned to the current. Kingfishers and herons worked the restored banks. Turtles rested on sun-warmed stones. Children who had been warned away from the water gathered to watch. What came next was not in anyone's plan. The community that had rebuilt the river decided it would also police it. Patrol committees formed from the same volunteer base that had done the digging. When individuals or factories were caught discharging waste into the channel, the community levied fines. Small amounts, but the message was unambiguous. The health of this river is a shared responsibility, and this community enforces it. No government inspector required, no court order necessary. The people who had done the work were not prepared to watch it undone. In 2008, Time magazine named Sant Balbir Singh Seechewal a hero of the environment, citing the Kali Bein restoration as evidence that organized community action could achieve what institutional programs had failed to produce over decades. Delegations arrived from across India and from other countries wanting to understand what had happened. What they found was not a replicable technology, it was a replicable ethic. Seechewal framed it in 6 principles, none of which required a budget or a bureaucracy. Treat water as sacred, involve everyone, use local labor and local knowledge, keep solutions affordable, enforce accountability within the community, make restoration a shared duty, not a task for outsiders. More than 50 villages across Punjab have since adopted versions of the decentralized waste management system that volunteers first built along the Kali Bein, digging their own settling ponds, managing their own discharge without waiting for government infrastructure. There is a word that matters here, one that outlived the river's death and has now regained its full meaning: Seva, selfless service. It was the word Seechewal used the morning he picked up a shovel. It is the word 3,000 people carried to the riverbank over the years that followed, and it is the word that describes, more precisely than any technical term, what actually restored the Kali Bein. Not engineering, not governance. The decision of ordinary people to show up and do the work themselves. 160 kilometers of living river, returned not by a program but by a promise kept. We didn't restore the landscape. We returned a community that knew how and stepped back. There is a question I keep coming back to when I think about the Kali Bein, and I'd like to leave it with you. If every river has a community beside it, what is it exactly that makes one community act and another wait? Leave me your thoughts below. If this story reached you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. There are more stories like this one than you'd imagine, and I have many more to tell you. I'm Tom Marsh. Thank you for watching.